Hello, and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Noelle Mering, who is a Catholic and an author, and she has written a book that was recently published titled Awake, Not Woke. And in this book, it's part of like a kind of a genre of books right now that are post or anti or counter woke. And in this particular book, I highly recommend. She takes a different tact than other books out there that I have read and whose authors I have had on this channel. In this treatise on wokeness, what the antidote is Christianity, and a particular form of humanism that is based in a spiritual understanding or a supernatural understanding. That might turn a lot of people off because not a lot of people are into the supernatural or the spiritual, with good reason. If you're not called to it, you're not called to it. But Noelle really maximizes the religious instinct that is driving a lot of the so-called woke behavior and counters that with a religious tradition that is centuries old. And there's just a lot of great, deep thinkers in the Western tradition that have the solution to a lot of the behavior that we're seeing right now. So I'm very fortunate to have Noelle on my channel. We speak about her religious trajectory and her stance on men and women and home and theology and God and community and so on and so forth. Excellent guest. Do check out her Twitter, and links to her websites are down below in the description. Without further ado, here is Noelle Mering.
Are you exhausted? You've been traveling a lot.
Am I exhausted? No, I'm just I'm a little discombobulated. I've been, I kind of took December off from my podcasting, and I've been working on an art project. So.
Oh, wow. That sounds interesting.
You're going to get me back into this groove.
Well, I haven't actually had anything for a few weeks, so you're getting me back into it too.
Oh, there we go.
We'll shepherd each other through it.
Okay. So I usually just start chatting and then go through it, but you are a Catholic. It seems like from reading your book, you're a tiny bit of that persuasion.
I am of that persuasion. I went to an evangelical college, so I know that world well too.
Okay. Well, so where did you start with your religious / spiritual by your home? Where did you begin?
I was raised Catholic. I have one sibling, and we grew up in Visalia, we were talking about, and my dad was he's a real philosopher type. He's an attorney by vocation, but he's always been a real intellectually curious person. So he's just always engaged me in those types of conversations growing up. It's part of my blood. But I was a typical American public school kid. You know, I was rebellious and I was going to Grateful Dead shows all the time. And so I don't know how much I would say I was practicing it that, as I grew older. And then in college, I kind of left the faith, not formally, but I really stopped practicing. I didn't know if I believed it, and then went through kind of exploring, what my peers were doing in their various evangelical worlds. And then eventually, I think my dad kind of realized that I was drifting away, and he started taking me to all these conferences, put on by like these giants of the faith, like Father Fessio and Ronald MacArthur, started Thomas Aquinas College. And those environments were super appealing to me. They were so deeply imbued with like just the intellectual life, but also, the spiritual life as well. And I wound up just deciding that I think this is true. And then my boyfriend at the time, he grew up at evangelical. So we had to have a conversation. I laugh about it because it sounds so kind of like a horrible thing to do. But I kind of just said, can you just figure out the next 6 months if you can become Catholic? Because, and it's not an ultimatum. I don't want to spend that much more time with someone that I cannot marry. And so he started exploring it. I knew he wouldn't convert just for me. He has a lot of integrity. So he started exploring. So he's a convert and I'm a revert. And then, that's kind of, we've been practicing Catholics ever since.
For people who aren't cognizant of the various degrees of Christianity, from your point of view, coming from being raised Catholic and then entering into evangelical circles, what's the basic difference between those that you noticed?
Well, a lot of the difference was just really phenomenological, right? Like they spoke differently about their faith, and they spoke about Jesus really casually in a way that was really lovely. They conveyed an intimacy in that relationship that I had not evangelicals that I hadn't really experienced. But I also, it's not as if I grew up with a really robust Catholic community life. I didn't. We would just go to mass, and there's my family, and that was pretty much it. All my friends, barely any of my friends were practicing anything, or cultural Catholics or something. So it's sort of an unjust comparison because I wasn't comparing it to having come from a robust Catholic community life. But I think that was the first thing I noticed. But the funny thing I remember, and this is one of the things that kind of set me on a trajectory, is that at my college, it was this kind of wealthy, a lot of kids from Orange County, a lot of blonde, tan, beautiful women, and surfer guys, and spoke very, ardently about the faith and about Jesus. But there was this real dynamic of kind of objectifying women that felt rampant in the community. And not in a super grotesque way, but just, it was in a way that was sort of just kind of culturally, casually prevalent.
The trad wife kind of? How were women defined then?
No, I mean, just like there's a hookup culture, and there's, there's like young men would just talk really casually about like women's body parts, and and these are the same guys who are like leading worship, praise and worship. And I just remember thinking like, I'm not really intensely into the faith at all. I'm not practicing Christianity very much ardently, but there's something really bizarre about, this sort of ardency, and then this kind of casual way in which we're sort of separating the way we think about sexuality and the respect and the dignity that we give to the body. And it wasn't, it was tame in a lot of ways. I'm sure far more proper and appropriate than it would have been had I gone to UCSB, obviously, or something. But it still felt like a weird disconnect. So, and I'm sure that happens at Catholic colleges too. I don't know that that's particular to the evangelical world.
Yeah.
But
sexuality is kind of, it can drive certain cultures, especially in the younger sectors of life. It's kind of all those hormones going on. I'm not justifying it at all, but maybe you're saying that even from the leadership perspective, there was a leniency around that.
Well, I mean, I think there's a difference between, that drive, like causing people to fall into sinful situations, and, like you get overwhelmed and whatever. I totally get that. I think that's going to happen at that age in almost any community. I think it was more that there was an openness. Like, you mean that there was such a casual way of talking about it as though it were no big deal. And not with everyone, but I just found it, and maybe in my mind it felt bigger than what it was, because I felt a bit different just having grown up Catholic and not being from the OC. And, there's just certain weird ways in which I felt a little bit, even though I had great, wonderful groups of friends, I just felt a little bit other. And so maybe I had just kind of looked at at what was going on a bit from a third, like a more objective perspective or something.
Well, yeah, we could tease that apart endlessly, because there's that particular culture. It's California. It's probably I don't want to misage you, but 90s, 2000s kind of time.
Yeah, late 90s.
Yeah,
late
okay.
90s.
I remember that era. I think we're probably of the same ilk. But there's that. But also within evangelical Christianity and Protestant Christianity, there is a abstraction of the female from the liturgy, from most of the experience of church in and of itself, other than, I guess, female singers, and females are participating in the worship, but it's in stark contrast with the Catholic conception of liturgy, and you end your book with some brilliant calls out, calling forth of masculinity and femininity in a more idealized form that is represented in Christ and Joseph and Mary. We don't, from my perspective, didn't really see or experience Mary explicitly outside of, I guess, Christmas and maybe Easter, and then the storytelling and stuff. But we didn't have an explicit sense of the feminine that I feel whenever I encounter Catholicism. And you even end with a quote from Chesterton, where he speaks about the Catholic Church and Mary being very similar in his mind. And when I've had encounters with the spiritual reality of the Catholic Church, it usually comes through the feminine or a feminine-ish or a Mary kind of symbolism. Pardon for rambling, but I just wonder.
No, I loved it. No, I think that's totally right. I mean, I think that shift of who Mary is really informs a lot, in the downstream from it. Whether Mary is, the mother of God and this woman that we revere, or whether she's co-redemptrix and she's the person who sailors, bend their knee and, ask for her intervention and, protection. And, there's a very different, it turns into a whole different kind of mountain of ramifications about the way we approach the faith, I think. That seem really important. And that's why I love that Chesterton quote so much, because I think he said he so identified her with the church. And when he was struggling with the church, he was struggling with her. And when he was drawn back to the church, he was drawn back by her, that she was so singular to the Catholic Church as a creature, but merely a creature, but one who was, so set apart as well.
I've spoken with, I don't know if you know him, but he's a brilliant man, Jonathan Pajot. He's a Greek Orthodox icon carver, but he runs a YouTube channel where he does a lot of cultural criticism or interpretation rather than criticism. And we have spoken quite a bit about the masculine and the feminine with regards to consciousness and logos and storytelling. And he makes a case that the feminine is implicit and is unstated. And when you try to make it explicit, it loses its feminine quality, which is a whole kind of conversation. We don't have to go in there, but I was just wondering if you wanted to explore or kind of express what the role of making the feminine explicit and how is the proper way to do that in a religious, and then from the religious into a, societal understanding of the female as the ideal or the female way of knowing and way of being. Because you end your book on returning to the self, returning to our reality as sexed creatures, in the part of rebuilding our way back from the woke world that we now inhabit.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's so fascinating. And it's part of my work with Theology of Home, too, which are the other books I've co-authored with Carrie Gress. But that's one of the things we're really trying to reorient in our minds, because I think that we have, in so many ways, this is an obvious point, have defined women only through the lens of men, and in a way that's inappropriate. So there's a way in which, I think what you're saying with the explicit implicit is that, you really don't understand what woman is outside of what man is, obviously. But I think we've defined the standard for women as being a standard that's very masculine. And, that's why we're always trying to divest ourselves of our femininity. But insofar as the culture is constantly attacking our sex bodies, in subtle ways, not even just with the obvious ways with the transgender movement, but just even with, I know you probably remember that growing up, I remember there's just this whole host of propaganda, it felt like, that made womanhood seem really stupid, in the effort to elevate her. You were diminishing her. So they just, that Bridges of Madison County and Revolutionary Road and American Beauty, all these, and then even the show Friends and Sex and the City. I watched all of those things and enjoyed them on certain levels. But it just was this constant effort to tell women that the life that is very feminine is really diminishing to them. And that sort of sense of women being kind of receptive, and the very feminine virtues of like nurture, receptivity, that these things are vital. They're not lesser than, sort of more traditional masculine virtues. They're actually really crucial, like relationships and nurturing and tenderness. These are really important parts of the human person. And both sexes are called to the whole scope of virtue, right? We're whole human beings. But there are ways in which women are sort of an icon of a certain way of being in the world, and men are certain icon of a certain other way. And they're both expressions of God's love. But if you obscure what those are, that particular femininity and particular masculinity, we really obscure our ability to understand a lot of supernatural realities, right? The Bible is rife with analogies that only make sense if you understand us as sexed beings. God is the Father, the bridegroom, the bride, the wedding feast. And the idea is that Chad Pecknold wrote a brilliant article recently where he's saying, God is not a father because he's like a human father. He's the primary analogate. So, human fathers are more fatherly the more that they are like God himself. But it's not, the scripture's not trying to make a sort of human anthropocentric analogy there, try to make us just understand him better. There's a real robust way in which he is father, and once we lose that idea of spiritual fatherhood too, we lose our ability to really understand all these deeper realities.
Okay, we need to do a little bit of language work, not to get postmodern, but to make sure that we don't get postmodern. But we broached into this realm of the spiritual. How is that different than just an analogy realm, or just a symbolic way of conceptualizing overarching patterns of existence? Like, what do you mean by spiritual? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, we have a whole immaterial world, right? So we are incarnate beings, but there is a real way in which, I think the spiritual realities are more real than the created realities, right? So God preceded us. He's eternal. He's created a place for us. I'm talking about that world, the world of the angels, the world, and we walk in both of these worlds, right? That's what's so fascinating about being a human being, is that we are always in both worlds. We are embodied beings who have souls and our bodies, composites of the two. And to ignore one or the other is to really deplete both, right? So, and that's what's so fascinating about living in the age now, is that the people who understand what is happening in the spiritual world oftentimes are the best ones to understand what's happening in the natural world, right? Because the first ones to defend the reality of the natural world. So that's what's so bizarre, is that we have all of this, kind of the woke ideology movement in such denial of nature, and you would think that they would be the great defenders of it, right? They're, in the language of scientism, that they should be the first and foremost defenders of it. But once you lose that proper order of the natural world and the supernatural world, I think you lose both. And so maybe that's a better word for it. By the spiritual world, I'm talking about what is supernatural, what is above nature.
And it's not a symbolic, metaphorical way of viewing things for you. It is a real thing. There are beings of light that are watching over us and seeking to channel us towards living within the light of God. Like that language is real to you.
That language is real. I mean, I think the Bible is, I'm not a theologian, but I think the Bible, there's a lot of symbolism in the Bible, right? And, I think there's a whole host of ways in which, I'm not a fundamentalist where everything is taken exactly literally. Things are written to be in different ways in the Bible. It's like being different types of literature or something.
It's a polymorphic text. Again, we're slipping into shaky postmodern territory, but the postmodernism is basically just a degenerate hermeneutics, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, ruining all of our ability to just have any epistemology, maybe. Well, there's so many things I want to ask you about. I really like that you pointed out that those who have a footing in the supernatural reality are the ones who are actually the defenders of the natural world and the reality of the natural world. But I have to ask this because this is how I run. How did you know that stuff wasn't fantasy?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I wondered if it was for a long time. And part of what helped me was I really tried to do a lot of work with both addressing the intellectual, challenges, but then also, how do I actually live this life out? And both seemed to confirm it in my mind and in my heart, the truth of the Catholic Church. So I went through St. Thomas Aquinas's proofs for the existence of God and St. Augustine's more ontological proofs, but ultimately, I think, when I wasn't practicing, I wasn't able to receive communion. And I remember going to mass and knowing I couldn't receive it. And, this is probably not a compelling argument for other people because it was such a personal one for me, but realizing at one point that I really did believe in transubstantiation at that point. I thought this is something that I think is true. And I have chosen to separate myself, and that rupture felt like one that needed to be addressed. And I think that the thing that's fascinating to me about living life as Catholic, and why I think I wanted to write the book, the woke book, is that our presuppositions have radical implications for how we live our lives, right? And whether or not we're going to achieve like not only supernatural goods, but just natural goods. Like what is my natural good as a human being? And in every turn, would try to make a commitment to what I believed is true. Like if I think this is true, I need to live it out. And so what does that look like to live out my presuppositions? And even when it's hard, to really make that decision and stick to it with a real fidelity. And in every instance that I had came up against something hard to live out, whether it be the church's teaching on birth control or, even just, we married young and we were terrified of becoming parents. And it's just a banal struggle, people have way worse struggles than that. But, it was personally affirming in my life that insofar as we trusted the truths of the faith, life tended to, even though it sometimes opened us up to suffering and hardship, it always ended up with a depth of fulfillment and a recognition that was aligned that was part of our natural good and also part of our spiritual good, and that these things were in harmony, even if it implied and included, a degree of suffering. And I think that in itself was its own way of helping me to know the truth of the faith.
So you would look at, over time, the wisdom of the principles that you had adopted work themselves out and prove themselves to be truly wise.
Yeah, and on a natural level and a spiritual level. And I mean, there's so many things that I find compelling. I mean, there's a whole host of miracles, scientists and doctors who have testified to miracles that are unexplainable on medical and scientific terms. And anyway, so just, I feel like filling your imagination and your understanding with all of these things that are kind of, you have to seek them out, that they're not going to be presented to you. When I default into like scrolling Twitter for an hour and a half or sleeping in or, drinking with my friends or whatever, there's so many things that get kind of my own struggles that pull me away from a deeper, more robust engagement with all these things that make them seem less real. And so I think that part of the path of the Christian is incorporating to your daily life an enchantment, right? Having an enchanting element of your life. That kind of pulls you out of the prosaic world and keeps you aware of the deeper reality within.
Your book, I want to call it an elegant précis, but I don't know how to pronounce précis. It's a thing. It's called, I'm showing it to the camera, Awake Not Woke. This is one of several books on this phenomena, the woke phenomena, or what we call the woke phenomena, and people can argue about that word or not. I don't care. But I always have to say that you can go ahead, audience, and argue about that word. But your particular take and take down on the woke is, it feels like it's in concert with a lot of other critiques that I have read and people that I've spoken with. And you do your due diligence and you go through and you show how Hegel and Marx and the Frankfurt School, and you do that intellectual foundation work, and then you argue against it. But what I really found very valuable about this treatise that you've written is that you have a positive morality. And I think that the problem with that is that it's not accessible to everybody, because not everybody's going to be Catholic. Not everybody's going to agree with your framing. You're apologetically Christian. But it's got a substance to it, and you can counter the woke movement, not just with tactics and not just with arguments, but with a positive moral argument that has, if you feel it, and I feel it, but not everybody's going to feel it, it has a spiritual reality to it, or it is, there's something real there that is opaque to a lot of people that aren't Christian or that live in and have grown up outside of Christianity, which is most of our America. And so trying to use that as the template to extend the wisdom of what you're trying to say as the antidote to the woke is going to have to go through some forms of interpretation for a lot of people. What do you think about that project? Is that something that you're necessarily concerned with, or are you just concerned with stating what you see to be true and allowing people to agree or disagree with it?
Yeah, no, that was that's a big conversation. It was something that I think about a lot, actually, because I have a lot of non-Christian, non-Catholic friends who are very progressive, dear lifelong friends. And, I've always kind of, in a way, maybe prided myself and they themselves on how we can love each other throughout, all these disagreements. The last couple of years, I will say, has challenged some of those, some not, but there's been some more strain, I think, just because the last couple of years have been so deeply disrupting of, so many foundational things. But no, I had to really, at first, I didn't set out to write it from such an obvious vantage point of a Christian perspective. That wasn't my initial goal. And I think I just, through conversations and thinking, just realized that, that I was going to lean into that a bit more, even with a subtitle, having the word Christian in there. That was a real debate. Like, do I put that word in there? And I think two things led to that decision. One, I think, is that when I kept thinking about who I want to write to, who I think my audience is, I kept coming back to people I love and people who I just knew maybe more, just see their evolution on Facebook that maybe I went to college with or whatever, who were Christians and maybe still are, but were getting so pulled into the woke thing. And that eventually, sometimes they would just be like, I can't even claim myself as a Christian anymore because I'm so repulsed by these people who, have stood against all these things that I think are so unchristlike, or, they're not marching with BLM, or the politics kind of informed their theology at some point. And I think that is something that I felt most compelled to speak into, is that idea that as Christians, what is our response to the woke movement? Would Christ have walked with a BLM, and would he be, supporting the reinterpretation of the word marriage and all these things? And what does true Christian compassion call us to? And that seemed like what I wanted to, the audience I want to speak to most of all. But that being said, I really tried to make a point to structure the book so that I wasn't arguing from an arbitrary kind of, or what could be interpreted to be an arbitrary authority. So, a lot of people scripture doesn't mean much to them. And so the book is not very heavy with biblical references. It is, I think the most of the argument can stand on the natural level. Even the talking about what man is and what woman is, I think that an atheist, a reasonable atheist could engage in that discussion. So, obviously I started off with St. Augustine and, Nadia Bolz-Weber, this sort of tension there. So I think there's a mix there, but I really tried to, I feel like I know who my core audience was. And I already knew that there were so many people doing so much great work that were not doing it from a Christian perspective. James Lindsay, obviously, and Chris Rufo, I'm not sure about his religious affiliation, but he certainly doesn't make that a prominent part of his advocacy. So it seemed like a niche that could be filled as well.
There's this YouTuber named King Crocoduck, and he got his start kind of in the atheist movement, or he was railing against kind of the encroachment of early social justice that has since metastasized into what we call woke. He's been battling the social constructionists. Before that, he was battling the Christian fundamentalists. And he just came out with a series called the Naturalist Nuke. And he designs this nuclear weapon to destroy the social constructionist philosophy. And he goes through this entire argument about how, about science and methodology, and a science as social construct is basically what he's doing, what he's arguing against. It's not a social construct. Science is natural. Science is the process that every creature that is alive is following these rules of science, which are just basic rules about examining the world and then making models of the world that are predictive and flexible and, then that benefit you. There's nothing that can persist within reality that don't follow these natural rules. And I was thinking, based on that, he's just talking about the argument for or against science and social constructivism, but there's also a lot of work to do with regards to principles and with virtues. On the cultural level, how do we return back to a very solid basis that's very reasonable, whatever that means, but still matches up with consistency, coherency, flexibility, and predictive, kind of a predictive power. And I think that there's a lot of work to do on that. And the question, I see you doing a lot of that in this book, and you use God as the kind of like the linchpin for everything else. There's this conception of God that allows the entire structure that you've built to stand up. And I guess you're not the right person to ask if you can do that without God, because you've chosen to do that with God. But I guess why? What is the worth of God in creating a moral order that is natural and yet facilitates the flourishment of the human being beyond just their natural elements?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder what you would think about how Jordan Peterson approaches it, because he talks a lot about the logos, right? And part of I started the book talking about the postmodern breakdown of our language. The story of the Wellesley College, where they're all using a different word for everyone, and it creates this cacophony of chaos. And that breakdown of meaning disrupts our ability to have a communal life, because it really disrupts our interior life. We no longer are able to think that our words can be markers for something that we're experiencing outside of ourselves. And then we use a bridge to communication with each other. And then how that ultimately is connected to the logos, right? And so I guess you could take God out as a, as a Christian, the logos is the mind of God, the person Jesus Christ, right? So, but Jordan Peterson can tease those apart in a way. I think he can talk about the logos without specifically referencing Christ. And he has built his career as, not identifying as a Christian, although, who knows where he seems like he might be on some sort of journey, who knows. But what would you think about that? Can you extract just kind of the Christian conception of God and just talk about the logos, and then that inform the rest of the argument? And do you think that would that stand in what you're indicating?
I think there's problems with it down the road, because I think that it can resonate on an intellectual level with people, but I don't think a community can persist without a community of faith. There has to be some sort of faith, and that faith can't just be this intellectual exercise. I think that the logos talk is it's fine for an abstract level of reasoning about these things, but where's the feeling of where's the Mary?
Too esoteric. Yeah.
Where's the Mary? Where's the incense? Where's the perfume? Where's the vibration of God? And so whenever I enter into the theological conversation, which I don't too often, whether I'm talking to a believer or a disbeliever or a believer, it's always like, if you don't feel the reality of God, there's no amount of thinking about the reality of God that's going to bridge that gap. So sure, we can do this, but I don't think what I long for is the reality. And so the church, various liturgical traditions have kind of built up layers to interact with all the different senses. But still, if it doesn't have the Holy Spirit, then it's pose, like where's the reality of that? But that's where the conversation ends for me, because you can't actually talk about that, which is the presence, right? It's either there or not there for you. You can sense it or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I wonder if there's just an order of operations and how people are going to arrive at that reality, right? Like the Holy Spirit can be operating in ways that which we do not sense. And, there's an old saying, grace builds on nature. So in some ways, the more you kind of can heal a person on the natural level, the more disposed they're going to be receptors of grace. And I think we're at a unique time period right now because most of the people, most young people are growing up fairly a-religious. I think that's probably fair to say. So there's, whereas before, we tend to be really reactionary, especially the less reflective, deeply thinking and reflective we are. We tend to just kind of react to the distortions that were presented to us. And so insofar as people were raised with a veneer of Christianity, but sometimes not maybe a robust and depth of Christianity, there was a way in which it was, a distorted presentation of something. It was either too harsh or too shallow or something. Or maybe there's abuse, but with this label of Christianity on it. And so all of these things created, I think, a generation of people who were so reactive against it. And now I think we're kind of in the opposite place where young people are coming of age and the thing they're raised with is the religion, as you were indicating before, sort of this weird secular religion that we've relocated all our religious instincts into all these weird kind of woke movement beliefs. And so at its core, it kind of gets pretty disgusting pretty quickly. When you have minor kids who are trying to, get chemical castrations and young girls, want mastectomies. And, there have been a whole groundwork of social pathologies that have been introduced, in large part through the sexual revolution and through our, a really increasingly degenerate media culture. And so there's real wounds that lay fertile ground to people kind of disposing themselves to these deeper wounds and more permanent wounds, that you have. And the kind of the core violence that I think accompanies this movement. And that's one of the things that I think people are maybe starting to see. You kind of, at some point, you have to waken up to it, where the violence becomes too undeniable. And so we're at sort of a unique time where it seems like everything's on the table again in a new way. That maybe the old answers feel fresh again, and they feel newly relevant, and people feel newly desperate. And there's been an overplaying of the hand of the movement. That I think sometimes I think I hear people kind of think it's really fringe. I'll talk to older progressive people I know who are still, they're old time progressives. They're not woke really, but they are kind of, more 1990s progressives. And they think, the chemical castration, that's so weird, but that's not really happening. I think it's too hard to wrap our mind around how pervasive this stuff is becoming. But as we start becoming aware of that, I think the old answers take on a new relevance and a new thrust that they wouldn't have had maybe 10 years ago. And maybe that's the good news, and that's the hope. One of the pieces of cultural hope that we have in this landscape is that people are really searching for something, and they need those answers to be proffered from someone, and it's either going to be offered by Christians or it's going to be offered by progressives. But we need to tell them what a human person is and what that means and what is their purpose and where their happiness lies.
You brought up the concept of, or the reality of the religious instincts, and towards the beginning of our conversation, when we broached the spiritual topic, I was thinking, well, what's the difference between talking about angels and powers and principalities and talking about gender and the 100,000 genders? What's the fundamental difference between a Christian supernatural kind of William Blake, heaven and hell kind of mosaic of all these spirits in various degrees of distress or some sort of transcendent pleasure, and this newfangled gender ideology, which is that's a great question. It's all immaterial. It's the same stuff. You kind of feel your gender, and it changes from one way to another. So it's still feeding into that same, or feeding on the same synapses. But what's the difference?
I think so. In some ways, I think it's sort of like a family versus a gang. Everyone wants to be in a family, but sometimes you can relocate that desire, that instinct, to something that's a facsimile of the family. Which is a gang. It gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of protection, but it's kind of built on this complicity and this sort of a guilt, which is different from the family. And I wonder if the angels and principalities, you could make a similar analogy between that and the transgender movement. Well, for one thing, there's a whole there's a whole literature, and St. Thomas writes in depth about angelology. There's a whole study of theology about the nature of angels. There's a metaphysics to them. There's a genus and species, and there's a way of understanding their nature. And maybe that's the difference, is there's a fundamental nature there. And same with the human person. There's a fundamental stabilizing human nature. And this is this is the second distortion in my book that I talk about, is that every communist or destabilizing regime tries to attack that idea of stable human nature. And so transgenderism is really an attack on nature, whereas angels it's actually in harmony with the idea of who they are and what human nature, or what angels are, what the nature of an angel is, rather than an attack on the whole idea of having a nature.
Yeah, if you go through at least the queer theory, but also the critical theory, you can trace it right back to Milton's Satan, that he would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, and you point to that explicitly about the enshrinement of ourselves as gods, and then all the outcomes of that. So my answer about the difference between ageology and queerology would be, well, let's see how people act when they kind of understand and have a sense of respect for these angels, and let's see how people behave when they start to understand and revere and worship these things called genders. You can see that the end game of that betrays. This is. I need you to help me with this. It betrays nature, but what's fundamentally correct about nature? Why accept that we have a nature? Why accept that we have this nature that we isn't within our nature a will and the power of reason to master nature, and why not use that will to reconfigure nature to be in better alignment with our wishes?
Yeah.
Why not do that? And this is the fundamental question going forth after the transgender movement goes to the next. It's transhumanism. So why stay within the bounds?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that to understand and to work in harmony, live in harmony with our nature, is to fundamentally understand that there is meaning, right? There's something about having stable human nature tells us what our purpose is. It gives us an end. I mean, it's a teleology, right? And so the work of working in harmony with our nature is to conform our will to the end, the teleology that's imbued in, that we discern from our nature, that there's we have a purpose. And I think the rejection of stable human nature is intimately, if not exactly, intertwined with the rejection of meaning. That there is a meaning to our bodies, that there's a meaning to that there is a teleology. I think it's ultimately there is not a teleology. There's one that you spin out into the world, right? So I'm not trying to correspond to the reality out there. I'm trying to manipulate reality to conform to my desire, which is itself a self-deifying process. And even getting back to the angel and the transgender thing, there's an order to the universe with angels where they are bending their knee at the Almighty, right? And we all are working within the limits of reality, which actually paradoxically frees us to fully it frees us from the prison of our desire to self-deify, and also frees us to really pursue what is our ultimate end. It frees us to live as we ought to live. So I wonder if that's another piece of that disorder, that there's not an order or hierarchy in which we extract ourselves from the natural order and supernatural order. It throws everything into chaos.
So if we have a purpose and it's based on our nature, what is that? You say at one point in your book that it's to perfect ourselves. Like, what is the purpose of being a human being? I mean, if you're feeling comfortable venturing into the telos. Sure.
Well, I mean, to quote I think the Catholic answer would be the purpose of the human person is to know, love, and serve God, that we may be happy with Him in the next. But in the natural order, this gets back to Aristotle. There's a whole host of human goods. So, there's a good of leisure. There's a good of the intellectual pursuits. There's a good of physical pursuits. We have a multiplicity of goods, but they are kind of united in, perfecting ourselves as human being. And what makes us most distinctly human is our ability to reason and make moral judgments. And so far as we develop and grow in those pursuits, we are growing more perfectly human on a natural level. But ultimately, that our purpose, we are made for God. And so we are made to know him, love him, serve him, and to ultimately be with him.
I'm trying to reverse engineer, if going back to the woke religion, like what is the God? And you bring it, we can talk about like their different value sets, the group. And the problem, it's been, 7 years since I went to the wokest of all woke colleges, and then I experienced the entire like explosion, like the end game of that. And then I've been studying ever since, but I just can't overcome how contradictory it is. They put your self-desire is more important than anything else, but also the group identity is more important than the individual. So it's just a nest of contradictions. So just on that alone, it doesn't work. But there still is a telos. There still is a God or an end that allows for all this contradiction to be aimed in the correct direction. And you can see that in a lot of activist discourse where hypocrisy, it is not a vice at all because the ends justify the means. So there is a God. And then if you go back to Hegel, you get this kind of this Geist thing, like this, there's this equation, there's a spirit of manifestation. We kind of see a heaven, a utopia, but I'm just trying to see like, what is the, like, what is that God like? And do we see that God in the Bible? Do we see the images of the woke God already being depicted in the Bible in relief, or a people who go along a similar path? Is there a spirit or a principality or a nature to that God that animates everything below it?
Yeah. Well, to get back to one of the things you said is that I think with the contradictions, well, for one thing, if you're fundamentally an anti-logos movement, then it makes sense that you're going to have all sorts of contradictions. I think one of the things that's interesting about the will over the reason and the group of the person, so the person is really reduced in the introduction into the collectivist mindset, right? The ideology gains all this power and the human person is absorbed and sort of reduced into the ideology. And the second distortion, it's sort of like it seems like a reaction in one way to that there's some, like there will be some recognition that you have to give people some sort of individual sovereignty in some way. We're stripping them of their ability to reason and be free thinking people. And so we have to introduce this individuality in some other aspect. And so that's almost what you're giving people, this veneer of, I find my unique. I do want to feel irreplaceable. I don't want to just be an instantiation of a movement of group identity. I want to feel like I'm special too and irreplaceable. And so we're going to give it to you, but we're going to identify it with your sexual proclivities. And this is how we're going to give you this weird version of a unique identity that individuates you because we've stripped you of it in the way that you most ought to have it.
The sexuality, then you bring this up quite a bit in your analysis. Sexuality is like the one undercurrent that can keep on fueling everything else. It's a semi-creative. Well, I would say it is kind of creative. Like there's a creativity within the sexual impulse, but once it's once you break it from the actual procreative activity, then you get everything that happens after that. But it's still that chthonic desire is still animating. It's an animating principle.
It is an animating principle, and I think it's such a powerful and important and deeply human one. And so, I think that it's been sort of a trite objection to kind of cultural conservative movement to say you guys are obsessed with sex or obsessed with well, everyone is obsessed with sex. Right? I mean, it's talked about ad nauseum in every media. Anytime I turn on any sort of media. And it also is the thing that affects us really deeply and really personally and has a whole host of ramifications. especially for the innocent people who come from the act of sex. Like what kind of world are we preparing in the microcosm and in the macrocosm for the innocent children who are coming into this world? And that starts with a sex act. And so, I think I sort of lost my train of thought about what you were asking me.
I was just adding on to your argument about once you strip people of their sovereignty as individuals, then you kind of give them sexuality, or you allow them freedom through raw desire. I just wonder what's the next step then, I guess, into the self-deification. Is that ultimately? Well,
it's still paradoxical, or ironic, because it's self-deifying, but it also is incredibly weakening, right? You absorb someone and tell them, there's little you can do to weaken a person more than tell them to just endlessly fulfill their desires. There was a study that I talked about in the book, J.D. Unwin, who did a cultural study, not from a Christian perspective, but he was saying every culture that is destroyed, either from the outside or the inside, the most common factors that they, licentiousness, sexual licentiousness, they lose certain, codes of moral conduct. And that there's a real weakening that happens to both individuals and communities, when we are no longer able to be masters of ourselves and virtuous in these really basic and crucial ways. And I think that what you were speaking about earlier about, is there a principality? Is there, it's interesting because I didn't really get into this in the book, but there is a real way in which, and I know you said you don't like to say, it's maybe not a good idea to say there's a mental illness here, but there's a real.
I just resist leaning too much on the metaphor unless we really just are aware that we're making a metaphor. So. Yeah.
But there is a real way in which I think that that this ideology is sort of the best systemizing or systematic kind of operation in the world of what. How the devil would operate in the world, both in kind of just in the way it's so brilliant in so many ways. The way that it really pulls people in. It's really enticing in certain ways, and it's so disrupting on such deep levels that in ways that really spread pretty quickly. So anyway, I don't know if your audience is ready for it.
No, I'm curious now. I mean, I like. Let's do a little bit of demonology. We already spoke about the angels. So how would the devil has a nature too? I mean, I'm sure Aquinas, maybe he didn't publish those treatises, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you listen to exorcists, I find it fascinating to listen to long form interviews of exorcists. And one of the ways, it seems obvious when you think about it, but it's just fascinating how much demons are narcissists. They're super sensitive. They get their feelings hurt really easily. They operate on your pity, and if that's not working, they pivot and start operating on your fear. It really I have known not in my family or anything, but I have had the hard experience of knowing someone who was deeply afflicted with a narcissistic personality disorder. And it's, I think you can't understand how blind it makes you to see yourself, and I think that is such, and that's part of what I talk about in the book a lot. It's just that, the antidote in so many ways to the woke movement, I think, is coming to self-knowledge. And the movement operates by bifurcating us from being able to see ourselves. It really is separating us from that sort of awareness, self-awareness. And the first thing that struck me when I came to realize that this old friend was, afflicted by this, that there was nothing that could penetrate the wall of kind of delusion and protection from seeing himself. He just wouldn't do it. There's no possible way. And there's nothing you could say gently or even hard, there's nothing. And, obviously there's hope for everyone, but it was, sometimes you have to realize when you can be only effective so far. But anyway, so this is what the exorcists talk about a lot, is that, that sort of, it's so similar to the ways in which we become we experience weakness and our own evil and our own pride in this life, where we're sensitive, we're easily offended, and we're peevish, and, we're temperamental, all these things. That it's interesting to me to see the connections between how demons operate, how the movement is trying to encourage us to become, and just what the ideology disposes us toward.
If we go, I'm wary of the trite and the shallow, not necessarily the metaphor themselves. But if you go back into Dante and you start to look at how he maps out hell, I'm sure that you could probably find a lot of different afflictions that these ideologies or these various different tenets, I guess, principles that are amalgamated into the woke movement causes people to basically be in these various states of hell. And if you ask, well, what is hell? Hell is being cut off from heaven. That's basically what it is. It's being in a state of being cut off from heaven. What is heaven would be, and I spoke with Lisa Marciano about the gender ideology a couple of years ago, and I was asking her, well, how do we know if an ideology is good or bad? Because we're going to have one. And she basically says you start to, things become wider. Yourself and your world becomes wider and wider. And I think there's this brilliant, crazy guy back in the 1600s or 1700s named Swedenborg, Emanuel Swedenborg, and an angel came to him and brought him through heaven and hell. And he wrote all these crazy Latin, like they're all mathematical and stuff like that. But he just lays out the spiritual reality or psychological reality, which comes from the root world soul. So we're still talking about the same thing, just within different language, of people in hell actually hating the light, and they're kind of in filth, and it smells really bad where they are. But whenever they encounter something that smells good, they recoil from it, like somebody in heaven would recoil from something that is, negative and stuff. And anything that causes you, I guess you said that anything that's anti-logos, so anything that causes you to see the beauty and ugly, right, or to adulate, to stray away from the beautiful, to stray away from the true, and to stray away from the good, those three vectors will end up leading you where? To adulating, creating bad art, creating bad policy, or at least bad action, behavior would be bad, and then how you would even formulate your opinions don't even have coherence anymore. So you've broken the truth part of that too. Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's so much of, it's so much of our goal, the goal of life is to train our affections properly. We need to, it's like there's an old children's story I used to read to my kids called Madeline. And they would say, one of the lines was, they would smile at the good and frown at the bad. And it's such a simple sentence, but I've always really loved it, because that's so much the struggle of life, is how do we train our affections to love what we ought to love, and to also see what is ugly and bad as being ugly and bad and not attractive.
But that's it's just such a profound mystery. I guess it's not necessarily a mystery per se, but it's just a big question in my mind. And there is a evolutionary kind of descriptor of why we need learning, why so much of us is social, because of how complex of a creature we are. We need to rely on our society to be trained. It seems to give credence to Rousseau and the social constructionists that if human beings have such a great amount of trainability, there's all this nature, but there's this trainability, then maybe we can train it and create a better human being or a better society. And you're saying that that's true too. So I don't know if this is a question you want to answer, but like, why would that be a part of a human being, to need to learn what is good and learn what is bad? What does that say about our nature, that we are trainable and perfectible in that way?
Well, I think there are caveats, right? Like, we are not trying to re-engineer the human person, like as though he were totally socially constructed. That the idea is that our minds are oriented towards the true, and our hearts are directed towards the good. That these are natural ends for who we are, but that there is a real way in which we there's a real way. I mean, that we are weak. We are weak human beings. We're fallen creatures, and so we are drawn to, the dazzling things in this world, and we ought to be drawn to them, but we get drawn to them in a way that's disordered, right? Where we put them as our higher good, and we, sublimate our, our real actual good. So trying to find a way in which we find what is beautiful in this world and the things that we're drawn to, and see that we actually are always drawn to the good. Even if we're doing something sinful, there's some good in there that we are being pulled towards. Or that would be the Aristotelian perspective. But so how do we take those things and see the good in them, but not in a way that is in harmony with our higher goods? And so we, how do we glorify God in ways that aren't, where we can enjoy a wonderful meal and not be so attached to the good food that, we are upset if we don't get it the next night, or, we, practicing detachment, all these types of things, mortifications. And so I think it's not so much that we're trying to re-engineer ourselves to love the good because we don't love the good so much as it is that we are just trying to strengthen our bond to what we already are naturally drawn and oriented towards, and make sure that doesn't get distorted.
Mm-hmm. It's a mystery. And while we were talking about this, we wouldn't have podcasts, we wouldn't have culture if we didn't have curiosity. And curiosity is erotic ignorance, right? Not erotic in a sexual way, but it's the charge of ignorance. So you can't have real knowledge without the vacancy of knowledge, in a way. You can't have curiosity and the joys and the pleasures of learning if you weren't created to learn. So that we have this nature that is teachable causes us, there's a pleasure in there. There's a kind of some sort of principle in there that speaks to some sort of gift, maybe even that's unique to human beings, that we are kind of born idiots because then we get to experience enlightenment, maybe.
I think that's beautifully said. And in some ways it's connected to, the same thing with mercy. One of the most profound experiences of Christian life is, understanding how much we need mercy. And then once we can kind of start to just even a small way wrap our minds around that, then we can look with eyes of mercy at our fellow human beings, right? And be slow to judge the inner world of another person because, we understand all the complications of our own inner world. And but that presupposes that we actually do need mercy because we're small and we're weak and we're there's fealtiness to us. But that is, without that, if we just were born perfectly virtuous people, what depth we would lose, right? In our supernatural understanding.
Okay. Well, you go my imagination just jumps to, well, if you were born an angel, you were born an angel, I guess. Like, then you probably have other things that you have to deal with.
True. Although the angels have free will. Obviously, even since the demons fell. Well,
then they just had one, right? They just have one choice, whether to obey or
Yeah, that's
rebel.
Right. You're right.
Do they have forgiveness? I don't know. Do they have redemption? I don't know. That's out of my pay grade.
Yeah, that's out of my pay grade too. I think the first thing you said was right, though. They had the one. Yeah, they had the one choice.
So this is a brilliant book. I think it's more accessible to people outside of your faith and outside of the Christian faith, well, outside of Catholicism and outside of Christianity. I think it actually speaks to a lot of really deep levels in our culture that a lot of people who have no need for Christianity or no need for religion in their day-to-day life might be able to grapple with counters to the metastasizing, malevolent cultural force that's now kind of decaying our society in a number of different ways. So I think it's brilliant. And I wonder, is there supplements to it? Are you working on another book? Do you have a lecture series planned for this? Are you going to do a little virtual? Have you been doing a virtual tour? And I guess you're on it now because you're speaking with me about it.
I've got a lot of travel coming up in the new year if travel's still happening, but I have an idea actually for an afterword of some sort where I think that maybe people are looking for a bit more practical, what do I do next kind of type of thing. And my restoration tends to be, a lot of like fix your, it's get your own house in order, it's a bit like that, or, understanding, being people who think with reality, right? I think that's the antidote to ideology, is that we have to strive to think with the fullness of reality in all aspects, scientific, philosophical, all these things. But people really want some practical answers. The hard thing about that is that it's so personal. I think it's so, one person, you have to find in your life how you can resist this movement and how you can build up a new culture and be part of the solution, and that's going to look different for every person. But certainly there's a lot of people doing really amazing work that's, building new institutions, and my good friends working with new foundings, and we're at the EPP. I'm at the EPPC and under Ryan Anderson trying to
wait, hold on. There. You can't just drop an acronym on my channel without.
Oh, sorry. The Ethics and Public Policy Center. It's a conservative think tank in DC, and Ethics and Public Policy Center. And Ryan Anderson is the new president. So to answer your question, there's a lot that's coming. There's a lot of things that we're doing with Theology of Home that we're hoping can be sort of in a funny way, its own, not in a funny way, but, people oftentimes will say, it's so weird that you wrote Theology of Home and then you wrote Awake, Not Woke. Like, they seem like two such opposite books, but actually in my mind, they really are complementary. I think that the woke book is just trying to help people, see in an accessible way, this is what's happening. And this is why you can have courage and clarity to fight against it and not be kind of manipulated by all of the accusations of, well, are you on the side of compassion or not? That we have to, helping people see through that type of manipulation, I think, is important. But Theology of Home, the goal is really like, how do we build a new vision for what human life can look like that is, full of flourishing and even imperfectly done, but still, beautiful in its own way.
Who's your co-conspirator on the Theology?
For Theology of Home, her name's Carrie Gress. She wrote, she's a prolific writer. She wrote The Anti-Mary Exposed, and she's a Catholic author. So we just finished our third iteration of our Theology of Home 3, and we've got some big projects coming up in the new year that I don't think I can quite discuss yet, but we're feeling excited and hopeful about those too.
Do you guys have like a little merchandise like Theology of Gingerbread Homes that people can create together and go through the virtues? Here's the wall, here's the trusses.
Well, that'd be kind of embarrassing if we did.
Well,
we actually do. We have a website, a shop, and we have an aggregate news aggregate website and a whole mercantile with product line domestically made.
Yeah.
Primarily, almost all domestically made. Yeah.
Interesting. But to get back to Awake Not Woke and the supplement to that, I think that you're onto something, and that's what I was intuitively thinking too. Like, this belongs in a book club, or actually the ultimate antidote is community, and we have to get back into previous models of community, which would be the church. There's a lot of wisdom that's locked up in how churches spread and how they operate, and there's all these horror stories about how they go awry. But there's a reason why humans had these centers of faith, and that's actually, if you go back to Tocqueville and the foundation of America, just as a civilization, it goes back to these really small agrarian communities and understanding our strength in this particular setup that we have going with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and et cetera. It really is based on a character and a culture, and it can't operate without that. This republic and this democracy cannot stand without a virtue and a character, and then also a culture. So I think that what a lot of this counter-woke or post-woke discussion is angling for is getting connected to humans, to ourselves, and to our families, and building from there. And I think that this is a pretty good tool for just a discussion topic and something like a book club.
Yeah, little platoons. Yeah, I mean, I think that's so much what is the effort is to isolate people, right? Is that, I mean, Hannah Arendt spoke about that the goal is not just political isolation, but also just loneliness. And we have such an epidemic of loneliness, and just getting back to human ways of living, where we have our communities, we have our little platoons, our mediating institutions, and those things matter far more than pontificating about them, but actually just living them, because it's we need to be with each other. We need to be with other people, and I think you're right on.
Speaking of non-pontificating activities, What's something that you do with your hands or with your that's not logos centric? What do you do that you really enjoy?
I've always been a big decorator kind of person.
Oh.
So, I mean, yeah, I don't, that was a kind of career I pursued for a while. So I really like the stuff of home. I'm not a big cook. My husband's a great cook, but, I do a lot with my hands is I cuddle my family.
Oh, really?
I'm a really affectionate lover. So I don't know, that's not really a cool maker type thing, but I'm a physical person in that way.
Do you guys have a lot of Netflix? And what are you guys doing when you're cuddling? You like watch a show or you guys read books?
I invite my kids into the bed in the morning when they first wake up, and we cuddle for like a good 10 minutes, or at night before they go to bed, or just sitting on the couch, or I don't know. And my husband and I are very affectionate. I love that physical love life of family.
There was a passage that you quoted, I believe, about tenderness. Do you recall that offhand in the book? What was?
Well, there was a quote from Flannery O'Connor, I think, right? That tenderness without Christ leads to the gas chamber. Something that sort of a secular, a bastardized version of tenderness is actually leads to human horror, something like that.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't the nice, pleasant note that I wanted to end on.
The gas chamber?
No. Well, Noelle, do you have a website? I'll link links to your various other things. Do you have a multimedia thing that you do? Do you have a podcast that you run with Theology of Home, or like a little like Mug and Muffin kind of television series where you guys sip chocolates and talk about Jesus and stuff?
We've done a couple of kind of interactive Zoom things with women who are part of the community, and but we don't do a ton of that. But we're hoping to maybe to dive into more of that next year. But our website, theologyofhome.com, you can subscribe for free. I also have keep all my personal articles and publications and media too, usually, or if I'm up to date with it enough, on my personal website, which is just my name, noellemary.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for writing this fascinating, again, elegant, precise, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Well, thank you so much. You were an absolutely delightful, engaging interviewer, so this is a fun conversation.